Good morning. Welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Christina Schaefer, Director of Social Media for HAR, and I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Klineberg with the Kinder Institute of Urban Research. Welcome, Dr. Klineberg.
Thank you, Christina. Great to be here. We do this once a year, it seems to me, something like that.
Yes, this is the first time we've had to do this virtually together, but you've got some information for us. I was able to attend your session last week and hear some wonderful updates now that we are here, which you can tell us a little bit about in a moment. But before we get into it, let's just have you do a quick introduction. I know this is not your first time on our program, but if you could just tell our members a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So my name is Stephen Klineberg. I'm now Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Rice, founding director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. And for 40 years, we've been doing this systematic survey of a representative random sample of Harris County residents, asking people with identical questions over the years, how do you see the world? What's happening in your life? And we have watched the world change. This is the most interesting and consequential city in America. And who knew 40 years ago that this would turn out to be really an interesting process of watching the city coming to grips with the 21st century.
Absolutely. I would have to imagine that just Houston, because of everything that has happened and how diverse it is and how much it's changed, which we will talk about, I have to imagine that's a very interesting study. When you began, because you said this was 40 years ago that it started, what was the goal of the survey at that time and how has that changed over the years?
Well, I tell people I get unfairly credited with having planned to spend my life studying Houston. It was a one-time survey back in 1982. Houston was booming. 1 million people had moved into the city between 1970 and 1982, coming at the rate of 1,380 people a week, 230 cars and trucks every day. Greatest boom anyone had ever seen, brought about by the tenfold increase in the value of oil. This was a one-company town. 82% of all the primary sector jobs in Houston were tied into the price of oil. Price of oil increased tenfold during the 1970s. No less than world demand. Boomtown America. It was also a city world famous for having imposed the least amount of controls on development of any city in the Western world. Who cares if it's ugly? So what if it smells? It's a smell of money. Come on down. So we did a one-time survey. Fell to my lot to teach a research method class to sociology majors. A friend of mine just started a new survey organization. So we said, let's get the students involved in doing a study of how are people balancing this tremendous growth with growing concerns about traffic, pollution, crime. What kind of city are we building with all this affluence? One-time survey, never occurred to me to do it again. 2 months later, in May of 1982, the oil boom collapsed. And by the end of 1983, 100,000 jobs were lost in Houston. We said, my gosh, we better do this survey again. And so for 40 years now, taking a representative random sample, Harris County residents, watching the city go into major recession and then recover into a restructured economy and a demographic revolution. And these are the changes occurring across all of America, nowhere more clearly seen or more sharply articulated than in Houston, Texas. So that's what happened.
That's wonderful. So this last year, which we really want to dive into this morning, the changes over this last year and your thoughts on the future of Houston. This last year has really affected us all, and the data that you have is going to give us some more insight into exactly how. But economically, we've heard so many things about the economy over the last year. There's been so many challenges. What are your economic findings from this last year's survey?
Yeah, so a big part of it was we did our last interview for the 2020 survey on March 12th of 2020. And on March 16th, the pandemic hit Houston. But now we're coming in toward the end of the pandemic, and there's more and more optimism beginning to develop in the city. But for example, how would you rate job opportunities in Houston? Excellent, good, fair, or poor was at a steady 65 to 70% positive ratings until this year suddenly dropped, but it dropped to just 62%, still high. And we asked people, for example, how have you been doing financially over the last couple of years? Things are getting better, about the same, or worse. Significant drop off in the people who said things are getting better. And we said, how do you think you'll be doing 3 or 4 years down the road? No drop off at all. New optimism. Houston's coming out of this recession. Serious challenges, but we're going to be okay. And so that was an interesting part of the picture of this year's survey. Absolutely. And then, of course, much more sensitivity to discrimination and concerns with the George Floyd killing and so on. Deepening recognition of the deep inequalities in Houston between rich and poor, between African Americans and Latinos on the one hand, and Asians and Anglos on the other. defining the central challenges that we face as we go forward.
Yeah. So, you just mentioned a little bit of this, but we've begun to hear that Houston is becoming, if not already, the most diverse city in the country. Again, 40 years of studying this, I know you know the ins and outs of it, but how have the demographics of Houston changed over the years, and what is our current status?
Right. I mean, that's really been spectacular. It is the story of Houston in the 21st century. The big story going back in history was, of course, it was Anglos pouring into the city during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This is where the jobs were. The rest of the country is having its stagflating 70s. It's Carter Malez. Houston was booming. And by 1980, Houston had become the fourth largest city in America, still an overwhelmingly Anglo city. After the oil bust of 1982, 35 years ago, the Anglo population stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And this biracial southern city, dominated and controlled throughout all of its history by white men, has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country, with a more even distribution among the four communities than anywhere else, with the possible exception of Queensboro of New York. We in New York are just sort of up, but truly striking. We are, and the other critical thing is that all of America is going to look like Houston in about 25 years. So we are there first. How we navigate this transition to build a truly successful, inclusive, equitable, united, multi-ethnic society will have enormous implications, not just for the Houston future, but for the American future. This is where the American future is going to be worked out.
Wow.
So, who knew? Just a fascinating new reality. Never occurred to us that that would be the case, but there it is.
Yeah.
It is Houston's destiny.
That's really amazing. Houston's leading us into the future. We've again, the pandemic has definitely affected us all. I know in some of the surveys you asked about how people are coping. So what are your findings on how Houstonians are coping with the effects of the pandemic?
So, well, in a variety of different ways. We asked people, how's your level of stress these days, and how often have you been bothered by emotional problems? And across the board, Anglos, Blacks, Hispanics, and Anglos, all about 55%, a similar kind of dealing with the stress of this remarkable year. But when we asked how you've been doing financially, it's just tremendous difference between the vulnerabilities of African Americans and Latinos compared to Asians and Anglos. And the gaps that we've been watching are just accelerating. And when you add to that what we were talking about before, the demographic revolution, that defines powerfully the challenge and opportunity for Houston. It is that ethnic diversity can be the greatest asset that Houston could have. As we position ourselves in the global economy, the gateway to the global marketplace, second largest port in the country. This ethnic diversity can be the greatest asset that Houston could have, or it could tear us apart and become a major liability, depending on how this generation speaks to this growing inequalities, predicated above all else on access to quality education. Houston and Texas are at the bottom in their spending on education. You didn't need education to make money in Texas, right? The big Texas fortunes were made from cotton, timber, cattle, sugar, oil. The source of wealth in the 21st century will have less and less to do with natural resources and more to do with human resources, with knowledge and skills. And Texas and Houston have to play catch up, and we're not doing it yet. And it's a real question for how is Houston prepared to make the investments that we need to make to position this city for prosperity in the very different world of the 21st century.
Okay, very good. Many Americans have experienced heightened stress and anxiety over the last year. What specifically did your findings tell you that Houstonians are stressing about?
We didn't ask what is it that stresses you, but as I mentioned, we found across the board equal degrees of stress. But then the other thing is that Anglos are now much more sensitive than they were before to the realities of discrimination facing African Americans. So a question is, do you think the criminal justice system in America is biased in favor of Blacks, biased against Blacks, or does it give Blacks fair treatment? And the percent of Anglos saying the criminal justice system is biased against Blacks has gone up significantly. That new perception we have sort of tried to avoid that reality. The inequalities in Houston and in America, but in Houston especially, are just palpable. And what this pandemic did was to accentuate those inequalities. The poor folks were even more vulnerable to the consequences of the recession. And that's an interesting kind of dynamic, whether that continues as we go forward. But that awareness that we've got to make those investments, we've got to make sure that African-American Latino kids are prepared to succeed. Let me add one other kind of piece to this, the demographic, right? I mentioned that the Anglo population pouring into the city during the 60s and 70s stopped growing after 1982. And Anglos are aging. The baby boom generation, 76 million babies born in that remarkable period after World War II when the rising tide lifted all boats. The average American man doubled his income, and the average American woman gave birth to 3.6 children. The baby boom launched the leading edge of those 76 million overwhelmingly Anglo babies turned 76 this year. And we're going to watch a literal doubling of people over the age of 65, overwhelmingly Anglos. And the young people are disproportionately non-Anglo, African-American, Latino, of everybody in Harris County, Texas, not inner city Houston, not HISD, but of all the 4.6 million people who live in Harris County, of everybody under the age of 20, 51% are Latinos, 19% are African-Americans, 9% are Asians, 21% of everybody under 20 in all of Harris County is Anglo. So the future of Houston has to do with that community of African Americans and Latinos. And so we have a real stake in ensuring that this generation of young people, overwhelmingly African American and Latino, who will be the workers and citizens and voters and taxpayers and purchasers of houses in the Houston economy of the 21st century, that they're prepared to succeed in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. That's the big theme that just pours out at you when you do these kinds of surveys.
If we could back up for just a second, just to kind of define the groupings. Lisa had a question about white. So, you're mentioning white, Black, Latino, Asian American. So what are you defining as white Americans or Houstonians?
Right, and that's of course a great question because ethnicity becomes more and more problematic, right? The other big story is that, and you asked that earlier about how are we doing in dealing with this diversity? Every question we ask about comfort with diversity, support for immigration has increased in the percentage giving positive reactions and is predicted above all else among Anglos, not by education, not by gender, but by age. Younger Anglos take for granted this diversity. We are falling in love with each other, marrying, making multiracial babies. Of all the marriages across America that involved an Asian in the last 3 years, 1/3 involved a non-Asian. Of all the marriages involving in Houston in our surveys, of all the married U.S.-born Latinos, 28% are married to non-Latinos. There's been a 600% increase in Black-white marriages in the last 15 years. You can see us moving toward a multiracial world where ethnicity will become less and less relevant. And the big challenge for the future of America and the future of Houston is not an ethnic divide, it's a class divide. In every community, a growing middle class and a growing underclass, predicated above all else on access to quality education.
Okay.
So that's a big summary of the 21st century.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of that diversity, and as far as, because I know you asked questions about race relations and racial barriers. What were your findings when it came to those two topics?
Yeah, we've asked every year a question: how would you rate ethnic relations among ethnic communities in the Houston area? Excellent, good, fair, or poor? In all three communities, significant drop off in the percent saying excellent or good, and only 25% of African Americans thought relations were good. So that's a big consequence, I think, of that 9.5 minutes of watching the killing of George Floyd, who grew up in Houston. And sort of, so that's had real impact on all of us, and it comes out in questions of that sort. So more awareness of the discrimination and more concern about the relations among ethnic communities in Houston.
Okay. In the past, we've had guests like Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, and Bill Dedman, who was the investigative journalist that headed up the Long Island Divided investigation, to shed light on discrimination. And some of the response that we received, or the feedback we received, was, but that doesn't happen in Houston. So what are your findings on how, discrimination in the Houston area? You've let us know a little bit, but, what are the findings that we currently have for discrimination in the Houston area?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, there's a new perception of that discrimination and the recognition that it's real and it's not just people complaining. But the broader picture is really a source of optimism. I mean, every question we ask has shown increasing embrace of diversity. As I say, it's tied into age. I tell you, you got to be gentle with us old Anglos. This is a big change. Is that fundamental law of human nature that says what I'm familiar with feels right and natural. What I'm unfamiliar with feels unnatural and somewhat not quite right. We older Anglos grew up in the 60s and 70s. That was a different world than the 1990s and 2000s. And so that's a real, I mean, Houston is the most ethnically diverse and is embracing that diversity more powerfully than anywhere else, and much more than you would expect, because it was a total shock. No one planned this. No one thought, wouldn't it be nice for Houston to be it's just that the Anglos stopped coming, and there was all this overbuilding because of we thought the price of oil would go to $100 a barrel, and then it collapsed. And we became the most rapidly growing city in America during those years, and overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And Houstonians, to our credit, have increased. And then, of course, this is such a richer place now. It's so much more interesting with the wonderful restaurants, the diversity, the color, the dances, the mariachi operas. I mean, Houston is a much richer place because of this diversity. And people understand that and recognize it. What they don't understand yet or recognize is the critical necessity of investing in education. They recognize how important it is. But for example, 50% in our survey this year, or last year rather, said 50% said they are strongly in favor of raising local taxes to provide universal preschool education for every child in Houston. Rich kids in Houston start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. And that gap continues to expand. And the brain is growing by 60%. And these kids are all ready to learn. And if they don't get that exposure. So we all understand how important preschool is. Houston is way behind San Antonio and Dallas in the percent of poor kids who get access to quality preschool education. We just haven't figured out yet a way to make the investments in a sustained way that will change the trajectory. And that's what scares me, because that's what we're called on to do, is to recognize. And the other thing I keep telling people, it's not just tax monies, it's also people. Every church in Houston, many of them are doing it. Every one of them ought to be providing preschool and after-school programs. Every business in the city ought to adopt a school and have a relationship with the school and the neighborhood where they're doing their business, and maybe one afternoon a month to let their workers mentor a child or meet with some kids or offer some help in the STEM field that the kids are learning. Becoming a learning society across the board is really, I think, the challenge and the opportunity for Houston in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That actually ties into, Kristen was asking if you could speak to educational opportunities for at-risk population, what has worked, what needs to be fixed, how do we ensure opportunity for our future leaders? So it sounds like you gave some great examples there. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, what we're talking about is cradle to career, from birth to college, right? And 14 years of education is the minimum requirement. So I tell people the most important institution of higher education in Houston is not Rice University or U of H, wonderful as these universities are. It's a community college system where you take kids coming out of high school with no skills and you connect them to the jobs of the 21st century. If you come out of high school and have no more than a high school diploma, and you don't have special skills as a performer or an athlete or an artist, and you just say, put me to work, Houston, ready to work my tail out, you will not find a job. And if you find a job, it will not pay you enough to support a family. The good blue-collar jobs had disappeared in this global economy where companies can produce goods anywhere. And robotics revolution, if you're doing a job I can program a computer to do, I'm going to replace your job with an intelligent machine. This is a new world where education, always nice to have, has become absolutely essential to a person's ability to find a job that can support a family in the 21st century economy. And we know that in Houston. We're just not yet prepared to make the investments that we need to make, not just, again, by raising taxes, but also by putting ourselves for greatest strength that Houston has is the quality of people who are here and the belief in this city that people have. How do we translate that into effective, coordinated action to prepare this next generation for success?
Okay. Just a comment that came in from Monica. She said, we're having story time for children under 5 years old at our real estate office once a month. So that's wonderful.
Good for you. Okay. Why only once a month?
So switching gears a little bit here. Obviously, realtors are concerned with flooding in the Houston area. Do you find that the average Houstonian is as concerned about flooding in the Houston area? And has that number gone up or down in the last year?
So we have three kind of critical questions here. One was, do you agree or disagree? It is virtually certain that the Houston area will experience more severe flooding in the next 10 years as in the past 10 years. 75 to 80% said, yes, I agree, virtually certain, until this year, when it dropped to about 55%. Interesting, it's hard to know what that means or why, but still the majority say it's virtually certain. Others, I think, are saying it's not certain it's going to be as bad as the Harvey, the worst flooding ever in continental United States. But then the next question that said, are you in favor or opposed to prohibiting additional construction in areas of the city that have repeatedly flooded? Prohibiting additional construction. No one likes government telling people in the private sector what they can do on their land. Significant increase in the percent saying, yes, I'm in favor of that. And then a question that said more generally, which of these statements come closest to your feelings, to your beliefs? We need better land use planning to guide development in the Houston area, or people and businesses should be free to build wherever they want. And again, Houston was world famous for the minimum controls and regulations. People should be free to build wherever they want. 85% said that we need better land use planning to guide development. Only 13% said people should be free to build. So that awareness that we're all in this together, that now that we're filling in the interstices of this spread out, multi-centered metropolitan region, covers a geographical space of 10,000 square miles. It's bigger than the state of New Jersey, but in that total freedom to do whatever you want on your land is no longer feasible in a world where your flooding or your irresponsibility on your land results in the flooding of my land. And we are in this together. And that collective understanding of that there's an affirmative role for government and regulation in Houston in building a successful city. That was interesting in the survey, that comes out in a variety of different ways in our questions. And I remind people, don't blame me, right? I'm just asking the questions. Here are the answers. And you can see the identical questions of samples drawn the same. People see the world differently today than they did 5 or 10 years ago. And it opens up new possibilities for us as we think about policy for this city, that the public is further along in its understanding of the challenges of today's world than most of us thought it was the case.
Okay.
So,
well, you've already made at least some difference this morning, Dr. Klineberg. Monica said they're going to increase that reading to children to once a week based on today. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you
Yes.
from all of us.
So you've given us a lot of information. A lot of it is very hopeful and sounds like all good news. What are some challenges that you're observing for Houston or Houstonians in the coming years?
Well, so obviously the big challenge is education, right? And we've got to figure out a way to address that, and we've got to recognize that we have not had to do that before. As I said, wealth came from land. Now wealth comes from knowledge, and we're making all kinds of new commitments with the ION and the startup companies that are going to try to position Houston as a major high tech incubator. Not just oil and gas anymore, but all these other, and then of course the energy transition. We know, and the public knows, that we can't keep burning fossil fuels because they have a direct impact on the likelihood of flooding, on the rising of sea levels, and Houston is a major perpetuator of those fossil fuels and a major victim of the results of the burning of fossil fuels. So there is an energy transition underway. Houston will either lead the way in that transition or will be superseded by the inventiveness of the rest of Americans in the world. So that's the other big. And then the third challenge is that if Houston's going to make it in the 21st century, it has to become a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America working at the cutting edge of knowledge, able to put that knowledge in commercial ventures, will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. That's a little bit of a stretch for Houston. We don't have beautiful mountains. We don't have great scenery. We have some beautiful places, but most of our beautiful places were made by us, by human beings, by carving out a great space. And now that the vulnerability to flooding is going to be a major challenge for the city. And it's a reason why I think the general public recognizes we've got to have stronger regulations. We've got to prohibit more building in those areas that repeatedly flood. We've got to recognize that we're going to live with water for the rest of eternity, and that water has to be shared and lived with rather than trying to overcome, because you can't. So it's a whole series of new recognitions that the strategies that we need to put into place for economic prosperity in the 21st century are different from the strategies that work so well for the city when its location near the East Texas oil fields counted almost exclusively for the wealth of the city. Houston's location in the East Texas oil fields is going to count for less and less, and eventually for zilch in the 21st century. The source of wealth will be attracting the best and the brightest people in America with the knowledge economy of the 21st century.
Excellent. Rubina asked if you could elaborate on the ION project. When will it be up and running, and what is the main concept? Can you give us any additional information?
It's not something I know a lot about, but we're very proud of Rice taking the lead with all the other universities, becoming raising venture capital for the new high-tech industries that are emerging, and for Houston to become, like Austin, a center for the new developments and for directing the venture capital in these new directions. But for Houston, the big thing is going to be that energy transition. And Houston needs to use all of its expertise in producing energy and distributing it to now produce renewable energy rather than oil and gas. And it's going to be interesting to see that. And the other great challenge that Rice has accepted, at least verbally, is we're building these high-tech centers in the middle of one of the poorest areas of the city, the Third Ward. And there's a commitment to ensure that the citizens living there benefit also with opportunities to acquire better STEM learning in the schools and for people working in the STEM to sort of reach out to the school system. So it's going to be a model, possibly, we hope, for how you can use high tech and connect it to education, inadequate educational systems, and improve those systems effectively and significantly. So we'll see.
Excellent.
But it's the way Houston is self-consciously reinventing itself for the 21st century.
Wonderful. You've given us so much great information today, Dr. Klineberg. What are some resources that you'd suggest our members look to if they're interested in learning more? I have one sitting right here next to me.
There you go.
But and you can tell us a little bit about this to start, and then any other resources that you want to share.
So we finally wrote the book. 38 years of tracking these remarkable changes, and things have changed since 2018, 2019. But the basic story is there. That's what we've been sharing and talking about today. The other place to go is to the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, kinder.rice.edu, and download the report. See if I've got a copy of it right here.
Here it is.
That's
the survey.
The 40th year of the Houston area survey. You can download that and order copies of the book and pay. And I tell people at the end, stay tuned. It's this city is absolutely fascinating. We've hired a new wonderful guy who's joining me sort of at the Kinder Institute, and we're going to be able to expand the surveys and to move into different areas and to ask different kinds of questions in a way that we hope will continue to inform and inspire the community. This is the most interesting city, and it is where the American future is going to be shaped for better or worse. And we have a chance to be a model for what all of America will be in the 21st century.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time this morning, Dr. Klineberg. Our members have been thanking you this whole time in the comments. Thank you for providing insight on these various topics of concern. They found the whole conversation very interesting. And we did provide some links for everybody in the comments, direct links to the survey, to the Kinder website.
Great.
And we can also go ahead and provide the link to this wonderful book that I did read myself. I've actually gone through it twice, but it's a wonderful book if anybody's interested. Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. Wonderful book. Well, Dr. Klineberg, again, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, you bet. Thank you, because you had great questions. It was great fun to be with you, and good luck to everybody, and keep up all the good work as we together build the city in these new realities that we're facing, that are tremendous opportunities for improvement of our lives, as well as a challenge to make sure we do it. Okay.
Well, thank you again to all of our members for tuning in this morning. Next Monday, we will be back with Dr. Maria Elena Battazzi. She is going to be joining us to give us an update as to what's going on with the coronavirus vaccine. So I'm sure she has a lot of information for us. So bring your questions that you have about the vaccine, and we'll get into that next Monday. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.